returning viewers, welcome back to the channel. To the new viewers, welcome to the channel, guys. I really hope you enjoy the content today because we are looking at a laptop for the first time in a long time, and I'm really excited, but there's just something that I want to get out of my system. Look at the size of that screen. It's huge. Now that I got that out of my system, welcome to the channel, and today we get to look at one of the highest spec laptops that I've ever got to review. It's actually the highest spec laptop. It's the ROG Strix Scar 18 from ASUS. Now there's a lot to cover in this review, and this laptop deserves a closer look, but instead of doing a closer look, we're actually going to be showing you all the different elements that I'm talking about as we go through them. So we need to keep this short because there's a lot of things to go through. So the first thing that you notice when you unbox and unbox and unbox, it's actually quite a layer of unboxing that you have to get through, is that ASUS has made this extremely sleek and professional looking. So what I mean by that is generally a gaming notebook is ostentatious. It really kind of screams at you like, I'm a gaming notebook. But what this actually does is it is almost professional looking, and then it does have the RGB effects, which I'll chat about a little bit later. But it does have those effects to kind of say, okay, I am still a gaming notebook, but you can put this on your desk almost and say, okay, this is just a normal notebook, but you're not going to get away from that screen size, because I'm used to a 13-inch screen on my, call it, work laptop. And every single time I looked at the size of the screen, it was just like, whoa. Talking about the size, let's look at the dimensions and weight. First of all, it comes in at 3.1 kilograms. Now, when I was told about the specs, or when I researched the specs of the laptop before I even received it, I was expecting something a lot heavier. So I think ASUS did well to not create something that's so heavy, which is important when I reach my conclusion. The dimensions of the notebook are 39.9 by 29.4 by 3.08. And the only reason the thickness of the laptop is 3.08 is because it's sporting a very high-end monitor or screen. For me at least, it looks like ASUS went out of their way to create a sleek and sexy notebook that is almost normal looking, in that if you are taking it to work or no matter where you're going, it could pass almost for a normal notebook. And that is because even if you turn off the RGB effects, which make it into a gaming notebook, the actual panels that you see aren't that obvious that they are off. Obviously, when you turn them on, it's going to be a light show and everyone's going to know, hey, I know exactly what that is. But even the rear of the RGB was such a cool effect, which I'll show you now. Now, throughout the chassis, there is anti-fingerprint coating, but it's not infallible. As you can see, it still does leave a little bit of fingerprints, but this is a big improvement on what I've seen in the past. Next, the mouse pad. They've increased the surface area and the sliding is still quite smooth like the Scar 17. However, I did feel that this was just as janky, if not a little bit more janky than the Scar 17, in that you really don't know when you're clicking. So if you're clicking on the left-hand side, the right-hand side, it's almost got like different pressure points in it, as well as the fact that I did test it, that you can actually, if you push underneath, you are able to enact the mouse click, which is okay, but not great. Overall, the build quality is very solid, and it does have that see-through effect that we saw on the Scar 17. However, I do think that ASUS actually made this a little bit more robust than what we saw on the Scar 17. The depressions on the keyboard area are not as depressed when you're pushing on them. And also, when you pick up the notebook, you do feel that it is very robust and solid, and that it's not just going to break, or any little piece of it's going to break, as it does, have wear and tear. The keyboard is really nice and tactile, and I can see myself gaming on it even more so because of the 18-inch screen. Normally when we're using a 15-inch or sometimes even a 17-inch, to a certain degree, you would want to put an external monitor, but I feel with an 18-inch now, we almost at that perfect area for gaming. Yes, again, it's large, but I would be able to plug in my peripheral mouse, use a keyboard, and be able to have a great gaming experience without having to really think, oh, I really need a bigger monitor. So really like that about the notebook. On the thermal design, ASUS would not let me open the notebook, unfortunately, but I don't blame them. This does cost a little bit of money, which we'll get to in the conclusion. But if we look at the bottom, which I'll show you in a little bit more detail as it does pan over your screen, all the intakes are taken in through the bottom, and we do have expelling that comes through the sides as well as the rear. One of the elements that I really did like is the rubber stoppers to prevent it from moving on any surface are actually raised. Now, what that raising does is it allows for more air to be taken in through the bottom, which generally, if you had to take a fan and again put it on your hand and try to see how much air it's going to blow through, the more you move the fan away from your hand, the more air it's actually going to allow to pass through the fan. So the fact that they raise this actually creates really good airflow through the notebook. It does have liquid cooling, which is conductor naught from Thermal Grizzly, so liquid cooling inside the laptop, which we've seen ASUS use for the last 3-4 years now, and is still pretty effective. Now, one unique thing that I have seen now is that it does have 3 fans inside. First of all, it has a fan mainly for the GPU and the CPU, but then also on the chipset, like you'd see on a normal motherboard or most motherboards, where either they would have a fan or a really raised heatsink, but this has 3 fans inside, so noting the effect on the chipset, as well as it does have really good directional flow with regards to the expelling of air. And if you had to open it up, which I can't, you'd actually see that there's foam as well as these kind of plastic or rubberized pieces at the top that pushes towards the top and center of the notebook, so that forces the air out in the directions from both the side as well as the rear. One of the questions that I get asked a lot is, how loud are the fans? Now, I can tell you on a decibel level, it was about 53, 54, but it wasn't a screeching, irritating sound. What you have to know about a notebook is that it is taking in a lot of air and expelling a lot of air in a small form factor as opposed to a desktop. So one has to be a little bit lenient when it does come to fan noises, but I recorded this on a very sensitive microphone, the NT1, at registering 53, 54 decibels, which I'll show you now. Now let's look at the specs of the notebook. First of all, the processor is a Intel Core i9. It's a 13980HX, which is a 24-core processor. It has 8 performance cores and 16 efficiency cores. Note that the processor does have onboard graphics as well, but for the dedicated graphics, we have an NVIDIA RTX 4090, which is the laptop version, so it does have 16 gigs of GDDR6. But to note, an important factor, and also a question that is asked a lot, is it does put out at 150 watts, but actually puts a further 25 watts on dynamic boost. However, when I actually tested, which I'll show you, it pushed a little bit past that on 181 watts, which is insane for a notebook. The display is the ROG Nebula display. So ROG have actually started naming their displays to actually be able to identify them a lot easier. It is an 18-inch display. It is QHD, but it is 16:10, so it's a different display in 2560 by 1600. It is IPS, it does an anti-glare display, and it does test at 100% on DCI-P3. And I will show you this when I actually do the test, because I did the test with an actual device that tests, being a data color Spider. Then the refresh rates are 240 Hz. The response time is 3 milliseconds. Really cool in the fact that it does have G-Sync. It is a Pantone validated display for all the artists out there. And it does have a mux switch, which is actually more part of the motherboard PCB than it is of the display. Memory-wise, it has a 32 gigs on DDR5, which is at 4800 megahertz. This is to be expected, but I do hope that this doesn't become the commonplace of notebooks where they are going to stay at base 4800. I do hope that they scale with desktops in being able to hit 6000, 7000, which is noted in a lot of previous notebooks, but again, I digress. Storage, we have got 2 terabytes plus 2 terabytes of PCIe 4, which is on the M.2 SSD, and it is put in RAID 0, which actually yields very interesting results, which I'll talk about when we go over performance. For the I/O ports or input-output, it has a 3.5 combo audio jack, which means that it's just one connection for your headset. Obviously, your headset needs to have a mic and a headset into one 3.5. It has an HDMI 2.1. It has a 2 by USB 3.2 Gen 2s. It does have 2 USB-Cs, well, actually one. The first one is a USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C, which can support DisplayPort, as well as power delivery and G-Sync. And the second is actually Thunderbolt. It's Thunderbolt 4, which does support a DisplayPort as well as G-Sync, and it does have a 1 by 2.5G LAN port. For networking communication, besides the 1 by 2.5G LAN port, it does have Wi-Fi 6E. If you are in South Africa, just make sure that you are buying a 6E device, which I don't think have arrived yet. But anyway, this is 802.11ax, which is Wi-Fi 6, and it does have Bluetooth 5.2. Talking about the audio, it is tuned by Dolby Atmos, and it has 2 subs as well as 2 tweeters, and I've done a little bit of a music test for you.
In time, you will know what it's like to lose. To feel so desperately that you're right, yet to fail.
Camera, and a real grr point for me yet again because it's a 720p. I will not say what I said in my notes, but I would have really liked to have seen a 1080p camera. However, I've also done a test to test the camera as well as the audio so that you could see what you would expect. So this is a camera and audio test. So from the camera we can see not that great, but you're not going to really get that great on a 720p. Also, if you look at the thinness of the laptop, there's pretty much no space for a CMOS. Even though the technology does exist, it doesn't make sense to kind of put that in this laptop, but I would have liked to have seen maybe a 1080p. That would have been great because it's always something that you had to add on. As for the audio itself, I've left the gate completely open, so you're gonna have to judge that one for yourselves. Talking about the battery, it is a 4-cell lithium-ion battery at 90 watt-hours. Now, a lot of people ask, well, how long can you game on it? It's not designed to do that. However, if you do want to game, you can. And this is actually one of the better laptops to game on with the battery, but it'll only last again about an hour, and you are going to sacrifice between 40 or higher on the actual performance. Watching movies was about 4 hours, and oddly enough, it only lasted 10 minutes longer when I enacted the power saving tools when I started to do the test, and I even did this with a stopwatch. So I'll put those 2 stopwatches ahead of you now. I did screenshots on my phone, but that was really weird, but about 4 hours, and you'd expect around about 6 to 7 hours on actual work if you're working on Excel, obviously not pushing the CPU too hard. The monitor, we've already gone over the specs, so what I'm going to show you is the results that I got. So I used this, which is a Spider X Elite, to test the monitor to make sure that what is being advertised is what is actually being put through. So let's go through those results. So these results, I'll put a download link so that you can pull the full results, as it's too long to go over all of them. However, the main ones is that it achieved 99% of DCI-P3. However, this was the second test that I conducted. On the first test, it actually achieved 100% of DCI-P3, which is the promise that ASUS gave. Otherwise, if we go all the way through to the results, it did achieve a rating of overall 4.5 out of 5, which is a really great rating for Spider. The 2 points where it did lack was on white point at 3.5 and luminescence uniformity at 3.0. Let's jump into the performance. Starting off with Cinebench, we hit a score of 30443, which is slightly lower than the median average of CPU Monkey, which is 31780. Nothing really worrying there. And the Tower next to that is actually a desktop processor, and the reason I put that in there is so that you can actually see the comparative data between a laptop as well as a desktop. Single core performance, we hit a score of 2132, very similar to the median of 2142. So basically getting your bang for buck there. Looking at Geekbench, pretty similar result to what we saw in Cinebench, so I'm just going to read the results. And the result being 16959 for my testing, the median 17097. The 13900K desktop being 20305. If we look at single core performance, 2808 for my result, and the previous generation of AMD 2036. But what we're focusing on here is really good performance coming out of the 13980HX on this actual laptop. Looking at a 3D Mark storage benchmark, we hit a really bad result, and I will explain that to you when we look at Crystal Disk. We hit a 1845, and you can see the previous results of previous laptops done. Gigabyte A7X1 hitting a score of 2215. The ROG, the Strix of the previous generation that I reviewed, 3381, and the Scar 18 hitting a 1628. Now, if we look at Crystal Disk Mark, you'll see the reason. We hit a read of over what the actual SSD is capable of a 10792 on read and 8526 on write. Then we have the real world performance of 4713 on read and 4494 on write. If we look at the IOPS, we have 126 on read and 81 on write for peak performance, and for real world 14 and 25. Looking at 3D Mark CPU profile, now what this test does and what's important to note is it actually tests the thread performance on a CPU. Now note that I have the Scar 18 with a base of 1174 and a top of 13448. Now this is because this CPU has 32 threads. I put my own desktop in, which is a 7900X3D with a same 4090 and 32 gigs, but this hit a base of 1079 and a top of 11679. Note that this CPU does only have 24 threads. And then if we look at the MSI Delta 15, this is a base of 887 and a top of 6400. So really important to note that you are getting desktop-like performance from this CPU. Next is PC Mark 10, and this is a test that tests the everyday performance or functions that you would do, like Excel or even some video editing, trawling the internet. So we can see that the SCAR 18 got a score of 8989, but it's not that massive over the SCAR 17 of 8209. But this is not really a point of worry, but an important thing to add just to show its everyday use. 3D Mark Time Spy, not much needed to be said here, with a huge score of 20322, absolutely towering over the SCAR 17, which is next in line with a score of 11750. The results from Time Spy reflecting in Time Spy Extreme with a result of 10464 for the SCAR 18, dwarfing the 5596 that I achieved on the SCAR 17. VR Mark Orange Room hitting a score of 15361, so not a huge difference between that and the SCAR 17 of 14080. But this does test a little bit differently, but if you do use VR Mark Orange Room as a derivative, you do have the scores here. Looking at performance test, I put my own desktop in here because I didn't have anything else and I wanted to show the relative performance. Note that my desktop CPU did change from the 7900X3D to a 7950X, but the RAM was not optimal because I'm busy testing RAM, so the score was low, so it actually achieved a lot higher. But talking relatively, the SCAR 18 hits a 10997, which is a massive score comparing to the 11124. Note that when I did test the SCAR 18 at first, it only hit a score of 7000. So what I had to do was I had to force the GPU to be enacted on every level of the test because it was using the iGPU on the CPU. Looking at the gaming scores, please note that everything was native in 2560 by 1600. All settings were on Ultra. For Formula 1, we had a minimum of 132, an average of 160, and a max of 177. So really good score there. Rainbow Six Siege, a minimum of 346, average of 395, and a max of 462. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, a minimum of 60, so dropping there a bit, average of 120 and a max of 189. And Far Cry 6, a minimum of 112, an average of 131, and a max of 147. Now these results are going to be important when we go to the temperatures. Looking at the temperatures, starting off with a 3D Mark Time Spy for the benchmark temperatures, the average CPU was 82, the max was 102, average GPU of 63, and max of 74. 3D Mark Time Spy Extreme, average CPU of 85, a max of 102, average GPU slightly higher on 64, and max of 74 as well. Cinebench average CPU 93 and max 96. GPU doesn't really count here because it's not used, so I won't mention those. Now looking at the gaming temperatures, for Formula 1, the average CPU was 94, the max was a high 108. Average GPU of 75 and max GPU of 79. For Rainbow Six Siege, average CPU 93, max 102, average GPU 72, and max GPU 77. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, average CPU 84, max CPU 95, average GPU 74, and max GPU 75. Far Cry 6, 94 for the average on the CPU, max of 106, average GPU 70, and max GPU 76. The last thing that I want to talk about in performance is the wattage pull. Now, if we look at the CPU package pile for 3D Mark, it was pulling 158 watts. For 3D Mark Extreme, 163 watts. And for Cinebench, 173 watts. For GPU, ASUS did say that the max was 150 plus 25. However, I actually saw it hitting 185, so the TGP actually overpromising there on 3D Mark. 3D Mark Extreme, oddly enough, a little bit down on 181, but still over what ASUS promises. And a Cinebench, obviously inconsequential, of a 35. Now, the CPU maxes were very worrying, but I wouldn't be too worried, and I'll explain why. Firstly, as mentioned, I pushed this to its absolute max, but what I was talking about previously when I was talking about the design or the thermal design was the proximity of the GPU to the CPU with regards to the heatsink. Now, if we look at Formula 1, it hit a high because it was choking on the CPU. But more importantly, if we look at Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we had high CPU temperatures, maybe not as high, but the CPU's usage was only on 2%. So this suggests to me that the shared link between the GPU and the CPU on the heatsinks was affecting gameplay when pushing it on Ultra. The last note on performance is note that the brick or power brick that comes with the notebook is a max of 350 watts. Now, if we did add the max TGPs and TDPs, it is going to go over 330, but this is not going to mean that the CPU is going to always pull that and the GPU is always going to pull the highest. It is going to obviously scale depending on what's being used. But again, really impressive performance coming out of the notebook, and again, almost desktop level performance. On to the conclusion, and this is a band-aid that we need to rip off right now, and that is the price. This retails between 79,999 and 87,000 Rand, which is a massively heavy price to pay for any laptop. However, we have to understand what this laptop is and what it does. Now, if you were offered any laptop in the world, what laptop would you go for? Would you choose this? Personally, I would say yes, because it's the best performance that I've seen, but it's all about who is using the laptop and what the needs are for. So who I believe this laptop is best for is for your traveling content creators, your traveling streamers, those who need to be able to have something that is portable and be able to have that power readily available. So this could be someone that is filming all the time and needs to be able to edit and render on location, a streamer that needs to be able to stream and game at the same time on location, no matter where they are in the world, and be able to know that the laptop that they're buying is going to be able to cover or be able to accommodate every single performance need without having to sacrifice quality for their viewers. To conclude, we did a little bit of a study to say, okay, what are we going to get if we had to compare this with a desktop of the same spec? Now, we did have to switch out, call it vendor names and so on and so forth to be able to get a direct spec, and funny enough, the price was very similar. Obviously, with a desktop, you're going to get a lot better performance, you're going to get more RAM on the GPU, you're going to get more wattage pull out of the GPU, you're going to get more wattage pull out of the RAM, you're going to get better cooling, which is overall going to affect the performance. However, it does feel like I'm defending this desktop, and that's because a lot of people on other reviews have said, oh, that is such a heavy price, it's not worth it. And honestly, I do believe that it's worth it if you are someone that needs mobility and power. So it's been very difficult over the last few years, or ever since laptops have come out, to be able to have something that performs at this level comparing to a desktop, and you are never going to be able to get that performance on mobile. And I believe we finally have a solution that does. Guys, I really hope you enjoyed this review. Look forward to seeing you on the next one. Cheers and goodbye.